Zuschauerinnen, liebe Zuschauer.
Dear viewers, dear listeners, welcome to another program in the series The Chain of Sacrifice. At all times, prophets and prophetesses of God, high spirit beings from the kingdom of God, came to the people on this earth. From the kingdom of God, they all brought His eternal word of love for God and neighbor, of peace, of freedom and unity, for a life according to the commandments of God. They enlightened their fellow people about the senselessness of the belief in gods in the system of Baal, and taught about the true God, the one God of love, and about the kingdom of God, which is freedom. At all times and in all religions, the adversary of God, the demon, also called the god Baal, has persecuted the messengers from the kingdom of God and murdered many in the cruelest ways. His system, the system of Baal, is a system of the rulers and the ruled, of suppression and death. Terrorism and cruel violence are predominant features of the Baal system and its earthly representatives, the guild of priests of all times.
And this brutality, this terrorism and lust to kill of the servants of Baal raged in the worst way against the messengers from the kingdom of God, because Baal and his henchmen want to prevent the exposure of their murderous law of demonic transfer, their undergrowth of persecution and eradication, by the truth from the kingdom of God, the love for God and neighbor, which the prophets of God bring to earth and live as an example. The prophets of God and righteous men and women, who at all times came from the kingdom of God to the earth, form a long chain until today. During their lives, each one of them made a great sacrifice for the clarification, the rescue and leading back of all fallen children of God into the eternal homeland. What these prophets of God, righteous men and women, had to endure and suffer from the diabolical guilt of priests of all times during their sojourn on earth is what we report about in this program series, The Chain of Sacrifice.
In today's program, we will speak about eradication, which was mandated by the Roman Church and applies until today. During its long history, the instrument of power, the Church, has shaped the system of violence in all its facets, developed in the spirit of the tin god Baal. The scholar of religious studies, Professor Dr. Hubertus Minnerik, writes about this in his book, The New Inquisition. For Pope Gregory, who was fascinated by terrorism and for whom everyone was a heretic who did not agree with a pontifical statement, the faithful flock and even many bishops seemed too lax in their persecution. That is why there had to be full-time inquisitors. They did everything more systematically, consistently, radically. For example, in 1239, the Pope sent the Dominican Robert Le Bougre into the Champagne region of France to check up on Bishop Moranis. This bishop was a thorn in the side of the Pope because heretics lived in his diocese and supposedly even had a growing following. The Inquisitor Le Bougre actually did this thoroughly. He placed the whole episcopal state before the court. Then he sent 180 people, including the bishop, to be burned at the stake. The Pope was satisfied. These victims of the Inquisition got off lightly. They were not tortured before being burned, but that was to change soon. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV promulgated the papal bull Ad Extirpandia, which in addition to conviction and eradication of heretics also allowed torture. According to this papal bull, the victims can be tortured until they have revealed their most secret thoughts, their disobedience in thoughts. Now, the legal terrorism of the inquisitors was no longer forbidden, but rather everything was permitted under the sun of papal benevolence. The inquisitors were responsible only before the Pope, who had himself addressed with His Holiness. Neither state laws nor the jurisdiction of the bishops could limit their criminal activity. Aside from the Pope, the inquisitors themselves were the highest law. They were lawmaker, prosecutor, and judge in one person. Nor did they have to feel constrained by any kind of human rights, because heretics had none. They were considered outlaws. One could cruelly deal with them unlimitedly. The door was open to every kind of capriciousness. The highest principle of the inquisitors was, it's better that 100 innocent people die than one heretic get away. A second one, we can make no mistake, commit no injustice. We act on behalf of the Pope, and he is infallible. The Pope had also expressly forbidden them to have pity or mercy with the heretics, for heresy of any kind suffers no tolerance. He, the Pope, would himself accept all blame if they should be inadvertently too cruel in their torture. And everything was done so that the inquisitors could feel secure. All who were present at a hearing and torture of heretics, witches, Jews, etc., were obligated to total secrecy. Anyone who broke the silence brought a ban upon himself that only the Pope could repeal.
What the scholar of religious studies, Minnerik, has worked out here also reminds me of the current papal obligation to secrecy in the case of child abuse by priests. This obligation of secrecy was reaffirmed by the Vatican Church in 2001. If instead of a charge against the priestly sex offender were filed with the police, an internal church proceeding was opened. All involved had to remain silent under the threat of excommunication. Thus, as formerly, anyone who broke the silence brought a ban upon himself. Let's stay with Professor Minnerik and read more. Thus, like the Nazi SS in the 20th century, the inquisitors could torture and kill with a clear conscience because their superior, in this case the Pope, assured them that their victim was a dirty, contaminated, and infectious enemy who had to be eradicated at any cost and with all means. The most frightening inquisitors were the incorruptible ones. They acted solely for the sake of the worthy cause. Their asceticism, in particular, made these pious Dominicans abnormally rigorous. They were accustomed to inflicting pain on themselves and had a spiritual longing to inflict pain on others. The screams of their victims were a kind of theological music to their ears, a proof that Satan got a beating. They also rejoiced like little children over the benevolence of the Pope toward them. He gave them the same indulgences as to the knights that went on crusades.
Not only did the one already standing before the Inquisition court not have the slightest trace of a chance, he could also land before this court totally without reason, because he was accused of heresy by someone whose name was never told him. He had no right at all to ask who accused him or what he was accused of. Nor was an attorney granted someone who had come under suspicion. And none would have been found who would have been willing to defend the accused, because the legal representative would have thus come under suspicion himself, and because the suspect would have been condemned anyway, and in any case. There was never a verdict of not guilty. With this, dear viewers, dear listeners, the Guild of Priests acted according to the axiom of the Vatican Church that is valid until today, which can be read in its collection of dogmas and which reads, She, the Church, must therefore with painstaking care remove and eradicate anything that is contrary to faith or in any way harmful to the salvation of souls. And so, it's about eradication, and how this was put into practice again and again during the course of the history of the churches. We continue reading Hubertus Minnerick regarding this. And witnesses who could bear witness to the innocence of the suspect were not allowed. But on the other hand, every scoundrel who served as a witness was guaranteed the secrecy of his identity from the accused. Every babbler, oddball, jealous person, gloater, pervert, madman was believed when they suspected another of heresy. Even perjurers, excommunicated persons, and heretics who in their fear accused others of heresy were accepted as informers.
And what all was not considered heresy? Anyone who possessed or read the Bible, which back then was officially forbidden by the mainstream churches, was a heretic. Anyone who had said something or other derogatory about priests was likewise. The priests themselves had written this in the Bible, in which it says, "The man who does not obey the priest shall die." Thus, absolute obedience toward the priest was demanded, and this sentence is in the Bible of the churches until today. Considered a heretic, so Professor Minnerick further, was anyone who had eaten meat on Friday or had not fulfilled his Easter duty, anyone who had not paid taxes to the Pope or bishops, anyone who blasphemed God or had uttered indecent curses, was fetched by the Inquisition when a resentful contemporary denounced him. In the middle of the night, suddenly the local chief of police with an armed escort and, of course, the inquisitor himself, usually a Dominican, were standing before the door, and with that the faith of the poor victim was sealed. In their desire for ever new victims, the inquisitors became more and more greedy and universal. Entire regions were accused of heresy. Acting on the authority of the Pope, they played the role of the real rulers in the country. When they first arrived in a city or principality, they placed their credentials before the civil authorities, who often trembled before them. Afterward, they had free rein according to their liking. The officials were merely marionettes who had to accept the sentence against the accused and carry it out. Usually, the people were called together to the biggest church or the biggest square in the city to listen to the inquisitor's sermon of threat and punishment against the sin of heresy. The effect of these sermons was not only panic and fear among the faithful flock, but also instilled in them the conviction that they must have indeed committed something heretical, if the preachers so convincingly claimed this. In any case, the success was sometimes resounding. For example, in Toulouse in 1245, after such an inquisitional sermon, 8,000 to 10,000 people confessed their heretical offenses. With such mass confessions, they usually got off relatively easily. They were given such penances as prayer, fasting, monetary fines, pilgrimages, etc. But whippings and prison sentences were also frequent. In grave cases, those who had confessed to their heresy often had to wear a yellow cross on their clothing as a sign of disgrace, just like the church had ordered the Jews to wear certain clothing or certain badges, so-called badges of disgrace, like Hitler's Yellow Star badge.
An dieser Stelle kann man ergänzen,
at this point, we can add that many of the National Socialist methods of coercion against Jewish fellow citizens have their prototypes in resolutions made at the synods of the Vatican Church. Here are just a few examples. Jews have to wear a distinguishing mark on their clothing. Fourth Lateran Council. Jews may live only in Jewish quarters. Synod of Breslau. Jewish books have to be burned. The Synod of Toledo. Jews may not take Catholics to court or give testimony against them in court. Third Lateran Council. And there are many more examples. Hubertus Minorek continues, the more independent and mature characters who did not consider themselves guilty of any crime and were therefore not willing to admit anything were the worst off. Once suspected of heresy and stubbornly denying their guilt, they were handed over to the secular branch for burning. In rarer cases, they were sentenced to life imprisonment, which was almost worse than being burned at the stake. Relatives or friends were not allowed to visit the prisoners. Those who languished in the dungeons of the Inquisition had been granted the grace of eternal oblivion. Damned to eternal silence and darkness, hunger and thirst in the midst of rats and vermin, some died of boredom. Others went crazy and tried to bore through the prison walls with their fingernails. One can see these terrible grooves in the prisons of the Bishop's Palace in Sens in France, for instance. They cast a dark shadow over the time of absolute church domination. There is no doubt that when the church rules absolutely, all who are not absolutely submissive have an absolutely horrible life.
Here, the warning of the well-known German philosopher Karl Jaspers occurs to me again, which he stated during the rebuilding of Europe after the Second World War. He essentially warned that with their claim of absoluteness, the churches are still today ready to reignite the pyres for the heretics at any time. The scholar of religious studies, Hubertus Minorek, writes further, but death by being burned at the stake or life imprisonment were merely the redeeming macabre bottom line of the Inquisition proceedings. The previous torture methods within the framework of the Inquisition proceedings were much more macabre. Even the Catholic lexicon for theology and church, which ultimately justifies the Inquisition, admits hardly any limits were set for the cruel practices of the torturers. There were also certain forms of mental tortures. The practice of the Inquisition is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the churches, thus the Catholic lexicon, and that all happened under the instrument of power called the Church, under the order of the Tin-God Ball. During the Inquisition proceedings, the defendant was already shocked by the trappings of the court. It consisted of one or two inquisitors, their employees, and the witnesses, and they were all hidden under hoods. The accused, already weakened by long imprisonment, was then granted tuition. This means that he was shown what would happen to him if he did not confess, that is, the torture instruments, in order to give him a salutary fright. If the tuition was not successful, they moved to torture, to the application of torture.
Already at that time, the machinery of torture had an astonishing diversity available, which confirms the theory that nothing makes one so inventive as the lust for cruelty. There was, for example, torture by water. The body of the accused was bound to a slanting tabletop or hovered freely in the air on taut ropes supported only by a footstool in the middle of the body. Then the victim had to swallow huge amounts of liquid, 6 liters for the small, 12 liters for the big water torture. Anyone who clenched his teeth had his mouth torn open with iron tongs by the executor. He then poured more water from a liter measure into the mouth of the tortured person. Many of the victims suffocated during the process or downright burst because the anus and urethra were blocked or tied up. Another torture was to screw and burn out the tongue. Another, to shatter the hands on an anvil or cut off hands and feet with a hatchet. It was preferred to cut off the noses and ears of witches or the women accused of immorality. Thus, the description of just a few torture methods. If we compare this with the dogma, and I quote, "She, the Church, must therefore with painstaking care remove and eradicate anything that is contrary to faith or in any way harmful to the salvation of souls," then the conclusion to this is that eradicate means to extinguish the life bit by bit through torture. And for such institutions, and it was just a very few torture methods of the Church Inquisition that we've heard until now, we still pay today, be it through church taxes or state subsidies to the church institutions, which all citizens have to finance, even those who do not belong to a church. The churches still maintain their persecution authorities today. They are just no longer called the Holy Inquisition. During the 20th century, the name was changed superficially first into Holy Office and then later into the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. But the dogma of the removal and eradication of all that is contrary to the Vatican faith has not been changed.
If the Baal artists were of a different spirit today, then they would have annulled the dogmas long ago, and would have knelt down before God and humbly given back everything that they had stolen during the course of their history. Instead, the Vatican Church sits on billions, and these billions were often stolen and simply taken from those they tortured and killed. So if they were of a different spirit, they would have given back the stolen goods to the people and the children who go hungry year after year until today. These people ultimately also fall into the category of eradicate. The stolen goods of the ancestors and the murder money of the Inquisition would have to go to the benefit of the starving children. That would be making amends. Another thought concerning this: what does it then mean for a state that year after year pays more billions to the descendants of such murderous vassals, as the study of religion has verified in many ways, and when a large portion of it is then added by the churches onto their already existing billions? The state then also morally shares the responsibility when at the same time children are starving in horrible ways. These victims too, as stated, ultimately fall under the category of eradication. Let's hear more about in which other ways and means removal and eradication took place with painstaking care over the centuries, as it says in the dogma of the Roman Church.
I continue reading in the book by Hubertus Mynaric. A masterwork of blacksmithing in service of keeping the purity of the faith was the so-called Iron Maiden, a punitive cloak reaching to the ground, however, not made of material, but of iron. The head part above the cloak represented a woman's face. Actually, the cloak was a cabinet made of iron and with doors. On the inside of the doors, as well as the back of the cabinet, there were iron spikes. The victim of the Inquisition was put into the cabinet Then the doors were slowly closed so that the sharp spikes stuck through his arms, and in several places his legs, his abdomen and his chest, and the bladder and the root of his member, and his eyes, and his shoulders and behind, but did not kill him, at least not right away. That usually happened only after a couple of days of the most inhuman pains and screams. Religious in the sense of a means for defending the true faith was also the so-called heretic's fork. With it, 4 sharp prongs were bored into the flesh under the chin and in the breastbone of the victim, so that he could no longer move his head and could hardly speak understandably anymore. But that was not the intent of the inquisitors. It was enough that the victim could still stammer the word abjuro, that is, I recant, which he merely needed to read, because it was engraved in the heretic's fork. But also the technically primitive instruments such as the saw or the stake thoroughly fulfilled the purpose given them by the inquisitors. For example, after the victory over the rebellious peasants, the Lutherans used the saw on several peasant leaders. They were hung head down, then the saw began its work between the legs by fighting forward to the navel and the breast.
Professor Minerick continues, the descriptions of the Inquisition's countless instruments of torture should not be continued here. It would fill whole volumes. Alone, the mere listing of the torture tools, the thumb and knee screws, the iron gags, the branding tools, the shrews, fiddle, and neck chains, the extremely heavy rosary that was hung around the neck, the closed iron rings on the heretic's neck, the iron cages, the head presses and cranial screws, the chain whips, the neck braces with thorns, the straitjackets, the Spanish tickler with sharp prongs, the clippers, the pliers, and pincers, the breaking wheel, and so on and so forth, can testify to the perverted and inventive passion of the inquisitors and their accomplices, and demonstrate the monstrous passion of cruelty that distinguishes ecclesiastical Christianity from all other religions. They walled the victims in, or, as a sign of the mercy of the tyrants, let them slowly starve. They drowned them in caskets filled with urine or slurry. They cut out or sawed out their tongues, or burned them out. They roasted the heretics on glowing irons, or suffocated them by igniting wet straw. After the invention of gunpowder, they exploded it near the victims, so that it tore open the chest of the poor victim. The evil spirit of cruelty found ever new means for increasing the agonies of the victims of the Inquisition. And all this happened under the instrument of power, the Church, lying in the name of Christ, in reality under the orders of the tin god Baal.
I continue reading Professor Minerick. In the patriarchal, masculine-structured church, it was inevitable that often women would be punished even worse than heretical men. The sexual aggression and perversion of the inquisitors could also be vented in special ways on them. There were special, specific torture instruments used on women. But in emergency, stones were also sufficient to accomplish the work of destruction. Women who had committed adultery were stoned or thrown into a pit of snakes. There was never a religion that preached so much love for neighbor and practiced so much hatred for neighbor and misogyny. Only in this one, although negative respect, is ecclesiastical Christendom of Protestant as well as Catholic provenance actually unique among the religions. However, it does not have uniqueness in the positive sense, in terms of humaneness and the protection of human rights. Every human right had to be put through against the bitter opposition of the churches, the Catholic as well as the Protestant. Above all, the Church struggled with the acknowledgement of the woman as a human being with equal rights as the man. Women denied dogmas less often than men. Actually, for this reason, they should have been persecuted less than men. But since they were accused of witchcraft, they could also be accused of heresy. Witchcraft equals heresy was the equation. And so, the Inquisition opened up a new, gratifying field of activity and self-affirmation. The inquisitors, appointed and sent out by Pope Gregory IX, reported to the Pontifex Maximus a horrendous spread of witchcraft and abominable pacts with the devil involving women of all walks of life. With burning concern, so literally, Gregory was the first pope to issue the order to persecute witches, which was to rage into the 18th century in the most varied forms and excesses.
With burning concern later became the title of a papal encyclica in the 20th century. And this formulation was also so used by other episcopal or ecclesiastical pronouncements in the recent past. The den of thieves, which the murder cartel left under the wings of the papacy, is far from being cleaned out, as the scholar of religious studies, Hubertus Mineric, and many other historians have verified. The pious sayings of today were also the pious sayings of those who had people murdered, who had them tortured, to then be canonized. The folk of Baal still worships this conglomerate today. Yesterday they executed, today they are celebrated as saints, and the folk is taught to pray to murderers. The French philosopher Claude Helvetius once expressed this in the following words: "When we read the legends of saints, we find the names of 1,000 canonized scoundrels." Hubertus Mineric continues, "One of the most exemplary experts on witches was the inquisitor appointed by Pope Gregory, Conrad of Marburg, a sadist of the highest degree. The later canonized Elizabeth of Thuringen had him as father confessor and could sing a song of his sadism. The present-day ecclesiastical sect experts, who scurrilously always cite against new religious movements the argument of tearing family ties apart, should for once study in more detail this trailblazer of the persecution of sects. For Conrad convinced Elizabeth to leave her 3 small children and completely devote herself to the care of lepers and the poor. As if this wasn't enough, he demanded of her, since she still seemed too unspiritual to him, that she should strip herself naked so that he could whip her, and he whipped her until blood flowed, over and over again. Whether Conrad made the poor woman more spiritual is still a question. In any case, he made her more fearful. Original words from Elizabeth. If I fear such a man, how must God be then? But at the time of Elizabeth's canonization, it was much more important to the Pope that she had been obedient to her confessor in such an exceedingly submissive manner.
Nicht alle waren bereit, das sadistische...
Not everyone was prepared to willingly accept the sadistic carrying on of this sadistic top inquisitor. After only 2 years of activity in German states, the outraged people slew him, but before that he had caused enough misery. The witches were not the problem in themselves, and in reality rather more in the minds of the ecclesiastical dictators, the popes. Almost every pope following Gregory IX increased the persecution of witches. Under the agonies of torture and in face of the inquisitors who craved ever new discoveries, the poor women volunteered ever more fantastic stories. These stories were largely adopted unseen by the papal decrees on the persecution of witches. In the Bull on Witchcraft, Summis Desiderantis Effectibus, issued by Pope Innocent VIII in 1484, which is also considered the official church recognition of witchcraft, in all seriousness the Pope raises the fantasies under the agonies of torture of the witches who had gone mad to religious truths. There are, so the Pope, many persons of both sexes who bodily mix with wanton night spirits, and, through magic means and with the help of the devil, ruin and destroy the birth of the women, the fertility of the animals, the fruits of the earth, and are able to hinder the men from begetting and the women from giving birth, and prevent the consummation of marriage. Men and women who stray from the Catholic faith have given themselves over to devils, male and female, and by their incantations, charms, and conjuring, and by other abominable offences have slain infants yet in the mother's womb, as also the offspring of cattle, have blasted the produce of the earth. After Pope Innocent VIII had presented these acts of witchcraft in his bull as real fact, no one was allowed to deny it anymore. Each who negated it was a heretic. It belongs to the greatest heresy if one does not believe in witchcraft, stated the book, afterward to be characterized as the hammer of witches. This sounds very similar to the popes of the 20th century, above all Paul VI and John Paul II, who emphasized again and again that the greatest trick of the devil is to have instilled in today's person that he does not even exist. And at the time of Innocent III, the lack of visibility of the devil was by no means proof that spoke for the accused women. On the contrary, they were consistently burned at the stake when they admitted they had slept with the devil and given birth to a child that no one had seen. Exactly this invisibility was considered especially dangerous. The invisible children of the devil could be everywhere and up to mischief.
Ja überall sein und ihr Unwesen treiben.
At the end of his bull, Pope Innocent VIII threatened with terrible punishments all those who should oppose the destruction of witches ordered by him. Thus, under the sun of supreme papal sanction, the orgy of witchcraft destruction could take its course. Still in the second half of the 17th century, during which nearly 1 million people, mostly women, fell victim to the witch trials, the Bishop of Bamberg, Germany, had 600 women burned. The Archbishop of Salzburg, 97 women. The Bishop Adolf of Würzburg, 219 witches and sorcerers. Among them 18 schoolboys, a blind girl, a 9-year-old girl, and her even younger sister. During the second half of the 16th century, the Archbishop of Trier burned so many witches that in 2 villages only 2 women were left. A dean in Mainz had over 300 people burned in 2 villages just to get a hold of their property. The orgy of the destruction of witches was incited more by the fact that the inquisitors, but also judges and confessors, who were by no means fussy about the confessional secret, in some places received bounties for every executed witch, so that the saying originated that the quickest and easiest means of getting rich was to burn witches. In any case, the brutality and sadistic cruelty of the popes and their war of destruction against the witches could no longer be outdone. Formally, the Inquisition and Inquisition authorities are considered specifically Catholic matter, but anyone who thinks that things have changed for the better with Luther's, Calvin's, Zwingli's, and Melanchthon's Protestant Reformation, which began in the 16th century, is quite mistaken. In terms of witches and heretics, the Reformers adopted the same attitude as the Catholic Church, in some cases even more inhumanely abusing the women accused of witchcraft. There is no doubt, however, that the hatred primarily against women made known in the persecution of witches was spread from Rome in the interest of the papacy. But when the Reformation broke out, the mania was not recognized and discarded, but continued to grow. Old women were persecuted by the Lutherans as supposed witches even more fanatically than by the Old Inquisition.
Many Luther biographers conceal in shame the fact that the Reformer considered women particularly vulnerable to witchcraft and sorcery, and it was because of their too great love for their children, because of their alleged stupidity, their lack of understanding, their fear and curiosity. In Wittenberg, he excommunicated women on the grounds they were witches. With the cremation of these devil's whores, as was said, he was by no means in less agreement than the popes. Luther's psychosis concerning devils and witches even grew with age. Thus he claimed in all seriousness that Satan resided in forests and rivers, which was why he was against bathing outdoors. Luther also firmly believed in the existence of so-called changelings and deformed dwarf-like children, which were allegedly to be a product of the union of the devil with the witches. Of course, Lutherans had to be particularly encouraged by the blind and fanatical attitude of their great reformer. On one single day, in 1589, in Quedlinburg, over 133 witches were handed over to be burned at the stake. At the end of the 16th century, 10 witches were burned in the area of Braunschweig almost every day. In Zuckmantel in Silesia, over 100 people were burned at the stake in 1651, including little children barely a year old, because the devil supposedly begot them. In Lemgo, East Westphalia, 38 people were killed as witches over 3 years during the second half of the 17th century. The mania knew no limits. As stated, it did not stop before children, and not even before old women over 100 years of age. In 1591, in Wolfenbüttel, for instance, a woman of 106 years of age was burned. But on the other hand, children were also good for something. In Protestant Sweden, their accusation was needed to accuse women of being witches in good conscience, whereby the judges refer to the Bible passage, "Out of the mouth of babies and infants you have founded a bulwark, to silence the enemy and the avenger."
Beide Kirchen,
both churches, the Catholic as well as the Protestant, bear an enormous indelible guilt for the demonization, persecution, and killing of so many women. We should also be reminded of the perverse art of invention, which serves solely to punish evil women with a great variety of instruments. A whole legion of torture instruments with sexual or direct vaginal and phallic character were used against the witches by representatives of both denominations. Here we will spare ourselves the listing of all sadisms of inquisitors of Protestant as well as Catholic provenance. It should merely be noted that the women not only had to endure the tortures that directly preceded the terrible death by fire, but often they languished for years in underground, cold, damp, and dark dungeons, teeming with rats, mice, and vermin. In addition, the younger women were subjected to rape by clergymen and prison wardens. Many witches were tied to wooden crosses or were attached to walls. They were left hanging in the air in the witch's tower, with their tortured limbs in chains, slowly dying of thirst and starving, and so on and so forth. The torment that was meted out to every single witch by the religion of love is nearly unimaginable.
An especially atrocious role in the persecution of women was played by a book, the so-called Hammer of Witches. It is the standard work for tracking down, arresting and punishing witches, and probably brought more disaster over women than any other book. The Hammer of Witches is the complete theory and practice of witch hunting, and impressively verifies that one can turn any idiocy into a serious theology if only one is perverted enough. For this work of unsurpassable macho-sadistic perversion and misogyny was considered an official casuistic commentary on Pope Innocent VIII's bull Summis Desiderantis Affectibus from December 1484, which had already substantiated the witch mania on high authority and introduced it in its indisputable law. The two inquisitors the Pope had commandeered as his beloved sons to write the Hammer of Witches were falsifiers and deceivers, of course, always working in service of the good cause of the Church. For example, to give their book a greater scientific authority, they got an expert report from the Cologne Theological Faculty. When this was not according to their inquisitorial taste, they falsified a second report and inserted it into the Hammer of Witches as a foreword. A few notarial documents were also falsified by the two inquisitors, one of whom, Henricus Institor, originally Heinrich Kramer, had even excelled at embezzling money from indulgences.
So these two prize scoundrels were now the authors of the infamous Hammer of Witches, whose instructions and code of conduct, which governed court practice, brought death and misery over Europe. The ecclesiastical sect commissioners of today, who constantly accuse new religious movements so as to stir up apocalyptic fears, should read in the Hammer of Witches how the fear of God was put into the people of those times. The devils, as it says therein, can destroy the whole world and plunge it into total chaos. They can directly influence people and even transform their shape. But could any kind of evil at all be greater than that of the authors of the Hammer of Witches, who advised all inquisitors to promise the accused women less penance if they would plead guilty to witchcraft, and then, after the admission of guilt, to actually grant them this lesser penance, but to nevertheless burn them a short time later? They said that the inquisitor, interrogating a witch, may promise her acquittal in the event that she incriminate another woman. If she does this, the inquisitor should actually release her, but immediately have her condemned by another inquisitor. Every, even the most infamous, most perfidious evil was allowed the inquisitors, if this were to serve finding the truth about the devil, who was not nested in the brain and heart of the tortured, but in the torturers.
Auf die Hexen konnte man alles.
Everything negative could be blamed on the witches. A bad harvest, disaster, any kind of misfortune, illnesses, epidemics, earthquakes, the witches were to blame for everything. And they were even a profitable business. Often they even had to pay their own torturers and their methods. There were lists of measures to be taken against witches and the corresponding price lists. The family of the victim had to pay for every measure. Many an archbishop, as High Inquisitor, became rich through this alone. Thus far, several excerpts from the book by Hubertus Münnerich, The New Inquisition. Until today, none of this money has been given back. Many estates thus also became the property of the churches, making them still today the largest landowners on earth. Until today, the state pays more billions to the descendants of the murderous vassals, so that the churches pile them onto their already existing billions. At the same time, thousands of children starve to death horribly every day.
We can use the word inquisition and persecution of witches very lightly. But what is the content of these word shells? Today we would talk about the gravest human rights violation, torture that even today is still practiced on the earth, has the intention of eradicating people who do not obey submissively and unconditionally. We've seen from the previous descriptions what eradicate actually means, to extinguish life bit by bit, which means torture. This means to not only inflict physical pain on people who have landed in the clutches of their henchmen, but also to inflict damage on their souls, indeed, if possible, to downright destroy them. The goal of the torture is not only to force confessions and statements, but also the destruction of personality, the obliteration of identity. The torturers know that people with no identity and with a shattered personality lose their capacity for resistance of any kind. The tortured person has to totally and helplessly lose any kind of inner support and all self-confidence. He has to cry and beg for mercy in panic-stricken, uncontrolled fear. He has to pass urine and feces. He has to want to be killed at last, instead of thus vegetating. The tortured person feels like an animal, dependent on the mercy of the sadistic master. Thus, even after being released, should he survive, the victim may somehow be physically alive, but spiritually destroyed. That is the point of torture. It means to destroy the victim in his integrity, to expel him from the community by using various torture methods, to take his basic trust in humankind, and to make him lose faith in society. The affected person should be seized only by mistrust, fear, the feeling of humiliation, of being rejected and of self-rejection until the end of his life. A victim of torture who survived the torture once wrote, "First I thought they would beat me to death. I was prepared for that. And if only they had done it."
Dear fellow people, and all this was inflicted on the tortured victims in the name of God and of His Son Christ. That is the diabolical goal of the tin god Baal and of his guild of priests. The victims will not only lose faith in people, but also in God and their Redeemer Christ, who supposedly is responsible for all that was done to them. How many souls have turned away from God and from Christ for this reason? How many souls cannot be reached until today by the word of truth from the kingdom of God and by the redeeming message of the Christ of God? That is why God's prophets came, His emissaries, the righteous men and women, again and again from the kingdom of God, to bring home to the people the eternal word of the all-one God, His teaching of love for God and neighbor, just as Jesus of Nazareth, who said, "My kingdom is not of this world." The prophets of God also felt the torments and suffered physically under the torture, just like all the other victims of Baal's guild of priests at all times. And how bitter was it for the messengers of God that they brought to the people the love of God and help after help from the kingdom of God, only to be, however, spurned by the majority of people and cruelly killed for the sake of the eternal word?
Dear viewers, dear listeners, the priests wanted to silence the prophets through the persecution and to crush their work of leading back the children of God. But they did not accomplish this. Therefore, the life and sojourn on earth of God's prophets became one great sacrifice, which in the sum total of all prophets becomes a chain of sacrifice. We will continue our television series, The Chain of Sacrifice, and present more facts about the stylistically confident synod of all too human arrogance, about Baalism in the religions of this world, and about the papacy in Rome. Until next time, goodbye and greetings in God.
మన షాప్ ఇన్విటేషన్ కళ్యాణ్ జ్యువెలర్స్ లో పెళ్లి నగల కోసం స్పెషల్ ఫ్లోర్ ఓపెన్ చేస్తున్నాం. ముహూర్త్ ఫ్లోర్
వెడ్డింగ్ జ్యువెల్స్ కోసమే ప్రత్యేకంగా ఒక ఫ్లోరా. సూపర్ ఐడియా.
అన్ని సాంప్రదాయాల వాళ్లకు కావాల్సిన చక్కటి పెళ్లి నగలు సూరత్ లో దొరుకుతాయి. ఆల్ ఓవర్ ఇండియా మనకి చాలా షోరూమ్స్ ఉన్నాయి కదా, ఆయా స్టేట్ స్పెషల్ జ్యువెలరీ ఇక్కడ తీసుకొచ్చాం. రాజస్థాన్ నుంచి పొల్కి, పంజాబ్ నుంచి కుందన్, కలర్ఫుల్ మీనాకారి, ఎనామిల్ వర్క్స్ లాంటివన్నీ తీసుకొచ్చి ఫ్లోర్ అంతా నింపేశాం. అయితే ఇంకేమమ్మా, లక్ష్మీ పెళ్లి నగరాన్ని ముహూర్త్ లోనే తీసుకున్నాం.
కళ్యాణ్ జ్యువెలర్స్ ముహూర్త్ వెడ్డింగ్ ఫ్లోర్ ఇప్పుడు పని చేస్తున్నది.